Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to an episode of Buddhish, an unscripted, mostly, an unbounded type of episode where we talk about stuff that is Buddhism adjacent or breaking news in the Buddhist world that we'd like to talk about. This week we're going to be talking about how the Dalai Lama, the sitting 14th Dalai Lama to be exact, has named his successor. The 15th Dalai Lama is going to be an 8-year-old US-born Mongolian boy who is one of 2 twins. For those who are not plugged into this sort of news like we are, this is a deceptively simple headline. And so we should unpack what all is involved in the decision to name this specific boy as the successor to the current Dalai Lama, and what all considerations have gone into the decision.
So, what does the title of Dalai Lama actually mean, and what is its history and significance?
So in the West, we think of the Dalai Lama as the Pope of Tibetan Buddhism, and this is actually partially correct. He's the spiritual leader of the Gelug, or the Yellow Hat School of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the newest and the most dominant school of Tibetan Buddhism in history. This school was founded in the 14th century by a monk and yogi named Je Tsongkhapa, and the school is an eclectic synthesis of existing esoteric Vajrayana streams of thought which existed in the northwestern India region and the Central Asia region at the time, with the Tibetan indigenous religious tradition that we know as Bon, and also some other existing Tibetan Buddhist doctrine as well. We'll do more episodes on Gelug Buddhism in the future. The Dalai Lama position is a lineage that goes all the way back to the very first Dalai Lama, Gedun Drupa, and even beyond. Gedun Drupa lived from 1391 to 1474 in Tibet and was posthumously regarded as the first Dalai Lama. We'll do an episode on him and why he got named the Dalai Lama posthumously a little bit later. But this position of Dalai Lama, as it exists today, is said in Tibet to have been created by Avalokiteshvara. There is this belief that Avalokiteshvara has a special relationship with the Tibetan people, and he established the lineage of the Dalai Lama and established Tibet as a Buddhist theocracy because he had made a promise to the Buddha to guide and protect the Tibetan people specifically. Many, if not all, Dalai Lamas are regarded as reincarnations of Avalokiteshvara himself in this very world. The successors are chosen by a variety of methods, but one of the ones employed in history is that the sitting Dalai Lama is supposed to go meditate on an oracle lake in Tibet and receive visions guiding them to find the next Dalai Lama. Remember this specific ritual because it's very important in history, and it'll be important when we get back to discussions of what's going on in the modern era.
What are some of the political considerations that could be a factor in selecting the new Dalai Lama?
The sitting Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso, was selected in 1937 when he was only 2 years old. It is a tradition that whenever these people are very young and have not actually grown up into adolescence or adulthood, that they'll be selected by the sitting Dalai Lama. Soon after, in 1950, his country of Tibet was illegally invaded and annexed by the People's Republic of China. Tibet had been under Qing dynasty rule since the 18th century, but it had gained independence when the Qing fell in 1912, and thus enjoyed about 38 years of independence. Then, the PRC gained power in China under the leadership of Mao Zedong and retook Tibet in 1950. In 1951, they ratified their total annexation of Tibet, rendering it a part of China's borders at the time. This was under the force of China's military. Tibet's options were to allow the annexation, surrender to the Chinese forces, and accept all of their demands or face genocide. The Tibetans didn't have a standing army to speak of, and they came to a very strained agreement with the PRC, but this agreement was very unpopular among the Tibetan people. And so in 1959, the Tibetan people led an uprising against the PRC. This caused a huge military conflict between the PRC and the country of Tibet, and all of the fighting caused the 14th Dalai Lama, who was now in his teens, to have to move to India with the assistance of the CIA for political asylum. It's there that he has lived in exile since the annexation of Tibet. We'll talk more about the uprising and the agreement between Tibet and PRC in another episode. Here, he set up an exile government for Tibet in Dharamshala, which still exists to this day. In fact, the Dalai Lama is not only the leader of the Gelug or Yellow Hat school of Buddhism, but he's also a political leader for Tibet as a theocracy. And so his proxy government as it exists in Tibet has the dual function of serving as a political body for Tibet and also a spiritual body. In the meantime, since this annexation, the 14th Dalai Lama has been the target of the CCP. His security and his freedom are constantly threatened by them, but he's protected by his proxy government and by a network of countries who are allied against China on the issue of their annexation of Tibet in 1951. His whole life, he's been an advocate for peace and for human rights, and I had the distinct pleasure of seeing him speak at Radio City Music Hall in New York City in 2012. He's a very humble, compassionate, and enlightened man, and that encounter with him was transformative in my path to becoming a Buddhist studies scholar today. The 14th Dalai Lama is 87 now, and though he is in good health, it has long been time for him to name a successor, or at least to start the process of choosing a successor. His inner circle has prompted him on the issue many times in the last 20 years, but things are kind of complicated. As I mentioned before, the Dalai Lama is simultaneously a spiritual leader in the form of Avalokiteshvara, but now he's also a persecuted political leader. To that end, the succession of the Dalai Lama is a very fraught issue. On the one hand, Avalokiteshvara's whole entire goal is to appear in the world in whatever form is necessary to save and guide sentient beings. Thus, he has the ability to reincarnate himself or not, depending on what he chooses, and depending on the needs of people. Hang on to that as we continue as well.
What are some of the spiritual considerations that could be a factor in selecting the new Dalai Lama?
When asked about the succession of the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama has said as long ago as 2004 that if the Tibetan people don't need Avalokiteshvara, then he does not see a need to reincarnate himself. Remember that he's speaking with the voice of Avalokiteshvara in this case. If they don't need him when he dies, then he says he won't reincarnate, but if they do need him again when he dies, then he believes he will. The problem is that he is not in Tibet right now, and he can't do the Oracle Lake meditation, nor can he search among the Tibetan people for the next incarnation, nor can he ordain them in Tibet if they are found. These are just a few of the several issues with the succession of the Dalai Lama, at least from the spiritual side of things. All of these create a huge problem. Imagine that the Catholic Pope was born Muslim and thus could not be found among the cardinal priests. Simultaneously, because he's also a political leader, imagine if the predestined next president of the United States was born outside of the US. This would be a major succession issue for the church in the first case, and for the country in the latter. The Dalai Lama also has other difficulties to face in his succession due to Chinese-Tibetan relations, which we should talk about now.
How have Chinese-Tibetan relations factored into the Dalai Lama's decision?
Obviously, China has been persecuting and policing and illegally governing Tibet with an iron fist in heinous fashion for the last 75 years. They are limited in a number of ways. They can't outright capture and kill the Dalai Lama, or he will become a martyr, and he's supported and protected by powerful members of the UN, such as India, Japan, the US, Australia, most Western European countries, and many more. Similarly, they can't inflict genocide on the Tibetans because of the same reason. All they can do is attempt to delegitimize the Dalai Lama by installing their own governance over the Tibetan people. This is based on a manufactured history which argues that the title of Dalai Lama itself was created by the Qing dynasty and is therefore under their jurisdiction to choose. That being the case, they have made use of a method called Golden Urn, which is a historical ritual process that does have several centuries of tradition to go along with it, but is not actually of Tibetan invention, where lots and tally sticks are drawn from a pool of names to choose succession. Chinese governance rules that the name that is chosen must go through that process, which they argue is Tibetan tradition, according to their own invented Qing histories, and that this name that's chosen must be approved by the sitting Chinese government. On that last point, you can imagine that they will never approve a name that they did not themselves put in the pot. To that end, they have essentially created a structure of lamas which exists as an arm of the Chinese government to rule over Tibet, and this structure is actually unrelated to the Dalai Lama himself. This is expected in the context of lamas who are actually in Tibet, which are high-ranking monks, but are not the leader himself, who lives away from Tibet with a close inner circle and an exile government. The succession of the Dalai Lama is a much more important and significant political issue for China. They've already said in response to the Dalai Lama's hesitance to reincarnate that it's not his choice not to reincarnate, and that the government mandates that he reincarnate and that they approve of who he reincarnates as. This is because their governance is reliant on their invented tradition of this Tibetan succession issue. However, because of this invented tradition, the CCP is set up to have complete control over this succession. The other side is that the Dalai Lama beat them to the punch and has, for the last 20 plus years, been questioning whether China will actually recognize his choice for a successor, which has already put the international spotlight on this issue of succession. As you can see, this has the makings of a succession crisis or an international political and human rights crisis. Amidst the backdrop of these many lines of tension in different domains of the Dalai Lama's decision-making, I hope you can see that choosing the succession is as much a matter of Tibetan Buddhist importance as it is political importance and geopolitical importance in the international stage. The Dalai Lama has, for many years, also said that the next reincarnation would probably not be born in Tibet. This is expected. He can't get to Tibet to find this person, and even if they were born in Tibet, either the Chinese government would disapprove or they would install someone who was an arm of the government. The Chinese have infiltrated Tibet and know who is ethnically Tibetan and who is ethnically Han Chinese, and therefore who is allied with the government and who isn't, and so on. So he just couldn't pick anyone from there. Similarly, he couldn't pick somebody from China, India, Russia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East, because there's a chance that they would be a CCP puppet. Most, if not all, the countries in those regions have very close relations with China. He also couldn't pick somebody from Africa, Europe, Japan, Korea, Oceania, or North or South America, because they would first and foremost likely not be Vajrayana Buddhists, and also they would run the risk of not being approved by the Chinese government. So who is left on Earth? That's the question that faced the Dalai Lama when he was meditating and deciding who to select. The answer, as we can see, was Mongolia. Mongolia is sort of a close ally with China, but at the same time, they have a very significant Vajrayana Buddhist population. Mongolia also has a considerable population of CCP allies, however, so he had to be even more careful than just choosing someone who he knew was Vajrayana Buddhist and who he knew was from Mongolia. Along comes an 8-year-old Mongolian Vajrayana Buddhist who was born in America and who is also a twin. This decision to name this person specifically as the next Dalai Lama has absolutely stumped the CCP. This kid is an American citizen, and so to capture him and brainwash him or kill him would be a major misstep in American-Chinese relations, which, as you know, are at their worst place in decades. He's Mongolian, so he's also a legitimate heir to the title of Dalai Lama because of their historical connection through Vajrayana Buddhism. His being Mongolian also garners Tibet a geopolitical ally because of their mutual standing with regards to the Chinese government. Although relations are good now, Mongolia has historically been a target of the PRC and of China in terms of being able to be conquered and a little bit of suspicion along ethnic lines. His being American also further cements Tibetan-American relations, which have historically been pretty good. His being a twin also adds a layer of protection. This may be where I put on my tinfoil hat and get a little bit cynical and a little bit conspiracy theory-ish, but my thinking is that if the 15th Dalai Lama and his brother are identical twins, then the twin who's not the Dalai Lama can effectively act as a decoy. He shouldn't be forced to do that, of course, but if the 15th Dalai Lama is in danger of capture, it's good to have somebody who looks identical to him in a different place so that the Chinese government and any other malicious party who wants to interfere with this has no idea which one is which and who is who and where one or the other is, and so on. This has been a really amazing play with regards to the geopolitical and spiritual circumstances facing Tibet now. We have no idea what will happen next, as news of this selection just broke several days ago, but this is a really fascinating window into the history of Tibet, the meaning and significance of the title of the Dalai Lama, and the current geopolitical landscape of the entire world, but specifically Chinese-Tibetan relations, Tibetan-Mongolian relations, Chinese-American and Tibetan-American relations, and so on and so forth.
We hope you enjoyed this episode about the recent selection of the 15th Dalai Lama. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.